everybody, Carl Larson here with part 2 of a tutorial series entitled Tracking a Child in After Effects. Today we'll be building on the information we discussed in part 1 of this tutorial and making a great looking title build using the Track a Child expression. As you remember from part 1 of this tutorial, we built a miniature solar system with a sun, a planet, and a moon. Then we used the Track a Child expression to trace the position of the moon in our composition. And this is important because if you don't know the background on the various models of the solar system, you probably won't get my one attempt at a joke later on in the tutorial, and, well, chances are it still won't be funny. But here goes. Aristotle thought the Earth was at the center of the solar system, then the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And as he looked out at the planets, he noticed that they didn't always travel in a straight, predictable line across the celestial sphere. Instead, from time to time, a planet would move in one direction, then the other, and then back along its original direction. This real phenomenon is called retrograde motion. And although we do see it in real life, it's not because the Earth is at the center of the universe, and, well, neither am I. But instead, we see this because we're traveling around the Sun and other planets are traveling around it too. And using the Track a Child expression is one way we can easily demonstrate this principle. But that's not what we're doing today. Instead, we're making a title build. So the first thing we'll need is 2 text layers and a null. Layer, new, text. Call the first one retro, using 40 pixel Gill Sans font, light, right aligned. Call the second one grade, using 40 pixel Gill Sans font, bold, left aligned. Flip the grade layer 180 degrees and line it up on the right side of the frame. Put the retro layer on the left side of the frame. Now let's add a null layer to our scene and we'll call it rotator. Layer, new, null object. Parent the 2 text layers to the null. If the parenting panel is invisible, you can right-click on the panels in the timeline to reveal it. So what we want to do is have the text layers shoot in from the sides, slowly go past each other, and then back up. So let's first do that. Selecting both layers, set a keyframe by clicking the stopwatch, then move 10 frames down the timeline. That's Shift Page Down. And move the layers so that the E and the O just barely line up. Next, move 10 frames down the timeline, and move the layers so that they've passed each other entirely and the R and G don't quite overlap. Next, move 10 frames down the timeline and back the layers up again, but not quite to their original positions. The next thing we want to do is have grade swing around so that the words read grade retro, which, yeah, is backwards. We'll do this by animating the rotator null first, and then compensating by animating the child layer separately. So selecting all 3 layers in the timeline, press P and Shift R on the keyboard to reveal the position and rotation properties for each layer. Set a keyframe for the rotation of the null and move down the timeline 20 frames. Now set the rotation of the null to 180 degrees. Since both the text layers are parented to the null, naturally, rotating the null rotated both of the layers. However, we only wanted the grade layer to swing around so that we could read both of the layers right side up. So now going back to frame 30, let's set the keyframe for the rotation of the retro layer, and then move back to frame 50 and set a rotation value of -180. This way, the retro layer will remain upright as the null swings around. That's because we rotated the null 180 degrees positive, so when we rotated the text layer 180 degrees negative, we get a net rotation of 0. Finally, we'll have to animate the position of the retro layer so that it doesn't land on the grade layer. No problem, just move it over and we're set to go. Next, let's move 10 frames down the timeline and add another set of keyframes to the comp. We want the layers to stay in the same place for 10 frames before beginning the next move. Now at frame 60, we're going to want both layers to flip around and do a 360 before landing in their final arrangement of retro grade. So starting with the null, let's set a rotation keyframe and then move to frame 80 and change the rotation to 360. Now we've just flipped everything over again. So let's get everything right side up by animating the child layers. Back at frame 60, set a keyframe for the rotation of the grade and retro layers. Then move back out to frame 80 and change the rotation value of retro to 0 and grade to 360. Now that we've flipped the layers over, they don't quite line up anymore. So let's move the retro layer into position, and then copy the keyframe from frame 50 onto frame 60 so that the layer stays in place before the rotation. Now to get the titles in their final position, set a keyframe for the position of the null at frame 90, and then bring it over to the left side of the comp by frame 110. So now we have our basic animation for our text layers. And not only does it look good, hopefully it gives you a good idea how you can make some really interesting motion by animating parent and child layers separately. Next, let's make the motion of the layers stand out by using our expressions from last time. So, layer, new, solid, and we'll name it Retro Tracer and make it comp sized. Next, let's go to Effect, Generate, Write On, and set the Paint On mode to On Transparent. Now, just like in our solar system model from last time, we want to trace the position of a parented layer. And due to the layer space transformation that happens when we parent things together, we'll have to use an expression to get the coordinates of the child layer back to the layer space of our composition coordinates that our effect understands. So, option clicking on the brush position, let's add the following expression. C equals, and then pick whip to the name of the layer we want to trace, semicolon. Now on the next line, type P equals C dot 2 capital world, open parentheses, C dot anchor capital P point, close parentheses, semicolon. Great. Now let's see what we can do to refine it. First, the brush spacing looks a little high. Sometimes for stylistic reasons, it's fun to set this value high for a dotted line effect, but in this case, I want nice solid lines. So let's turn it nearly all the way down to 0.002. There we go. Let's also turn down the opacity to 20%. Okay, now let's duplicate the write-on effect and have it draw 2 lines on the tracer layer. So select the effect and duplicate it, Command D or Control D. For write-on 2, let's set the brush size to 8 pixels, change the hardness to 100, and turn down the opacity to 10. Then change the paint mode to On Original Image, so that we don't overwrite the first instance of the plugin. Now let's take a quick RAM preview of that just to see how things are shaping up. That looks great, but it's not as dynamic as it could be. Let's change the stroke length time so that the line not only writes on, but that it also writes off after a given amount of time. So for the first instance, let's set the stroke length to 2.5, and for the second, let's set it to 2. Let's take another RAM preview and see how it looks. Very nice. One thing to keep in mind is that the stroke length function actually causes render times to go up substantially. So let's turn that back down to 0 for now, and then at the end, turn them back up to where we want them to be. So now that we've got the tracer working for the retro layer, let's do the same thing for the grade layer. Select the Retro Tracer layer in the timeline and go to Edit, Duplicate. Let's rename the layer by selecting the name, pressing Enter or Return on the keyboard, and renaming it to Grade Tracer. Next, pressing U on the keyboard to reveal the used properties of the layer, we'll have to update the expressions to track the grade layer instead of the retro layer. Simply click in the expression and change the layer name from Retro to Grade. Remember, this is case sensitive, so to be sure that you type things correctly. And speaking of which, if you use my cheating I don't like to type method that I showed you last week using the pick whip, you'll actually have to change the name in 2 places, or you can just re-pick whip them. If instead you use the compact form of the code, like Michael Natkin and Dan Ebert used in their examples, you only have to change it here. Again, use whatever method works for you. Now we have one layer tracing the position of the retro layer, and the other tracing the position of the grade layer. Leaving the first instance the way it is, let's duplicate write-on 2, so that we have 3 copies of the plugin. Now change the brush width of write-on 2 to 16. Change the brush width of write-on 3 to 32, and set the opacity to 5. Alright, final touches. Let's move the tracer layers below the text layers and add a gradient to the background. Layer, New, Solid. Call it Background, make it comp sized, and put it in the bottom of the layer stack. Then go to Effect, Generate, Ramp. And reposition the ramp control so that we have black in the upper right-hand corner, and so that you have white beyond the lower left-hand corner. Change the end color to something bluish so that the text stands out, and it's starting to look pretty nice. Next, let's add in a line of subtext and one additional tracer. To do this, let's select the text layer and tracer layer in the timeline. So I'll grab the grade layer and the retro text layer, duplicate them, and move to the end of the timeline. Just to keep things moving along, I'll unparent the copy of the text layer that we just created, pressing U on the keyboard to reveal the animated properties of the layer that we had put in there before. Let's click on the stopwatch to undo any animation that was previously applied. Now move the layer into position. Let's rename the subtext to something really informative, like Aristotle had it backwards. You see that's funny because retrograde motion does go backwards, but he had his explanation backwards, and well, yeah, it's not funny. But I needed some type of placeholder text, and that worked. Now set a keyframe for the final position of the layer, and then move back to frame 90 to move the subtext off screen. Let's get that third tracer layer working by adding a new null to the scene. Layer, new, null object. Let's rename the null to subtext null. We'll use this null to drive the position of the subtext tracer's write-on effects. Reorganize the timeline just to keep things tidy, and now let's animate the position of the subtext null to go with the subtext. So let's start it just off screen and then bring it across the comp in 20 frames. Shift page down, page down. Have it stop somewhere in frame but near the right edge of the comp. Now all we need to do is update the expression on the subtext tracer layer to have it follow the position of the subtext null. So we'll simply press UU on the keyboard to reveal the used properties of the layer and update the expression to track the position of the subtext null layer. To make this change, simply click into the expression to highlight the code and pick whip to the position property of the subtext tracer null to replace it. Now we'll repeat that for the other two instances of the plugin. There we go. Now I'll do a little more cleanup by twirling shut the layers and changing the sort order so that the layers are more logically organized. As a final step, let's select the tracer layers and turn up the stroke length times to where we had them before. So selecting the grade tracer layer, change the stroke length time of write-on 1 to 1 second, write-on 2 to 1.5 seconds, and write-on 3 to 2 seconds. In the subtext tracer, we'll do the same thing, 1, 1.5, and 2 seconds respectively. Now selecting the animated layers and pressing U to reveal the animated properties, select all of the keyframes and press F9 to apply an easy ease interpolation to the entire animation. This way, the motion of our layers will have a smooth start and stop to them instead of an abrupt motion. Let's also change the composite mode of the tracer layers to add to give them a little more punch. Okay, let's give it one final RAM preview and see how everything came together. That's great. We've got a nice clean title build using nulls, expressions, and the write-on effect. Well, I hope you learned something new today by watching this tutorial, and found something you can apply to your own projects. So until next time, I'm Carl Larson for CreativeCow.net.